No.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Hello, my name is Kendall Barney, and I'm a first-year graduate student at University of Montana. I'm going to be presenting my paper, You Know, for a Clownfish, He Really Isn't That Funny. Implications of Grief and Masculinity through a Narrative Analysis of Finding Nemo. This analysis highlights social expectations of grief by using Fisher's narrative paradigm to argue that Finding Nemo is a film that perpetuates hegemonic ideals of masculinity and grief. Finding Nemo was written and produced by Disney and Pixar in 2003. For those of you who have not seen the film before, it begins with a clownfish couple, Coral and Marlin, celebrating the luxuries of their new home and fantasizing about the lives them and their soon-to-be 400 children are going to live there. Coral, the mother, swims beyond the drop-off into the open ocean to come face-to-face with the barracuda, an attack that results in her and 399 of their eggs presumably being eaten. This scene procures the story of an anxious, overprotective father clownfish, Marlin, and his grand adventure across the ocean to save his son, Nemo, after he is kidnapped by two scuba divers. The film presents a story that offers a heartwarming emotional appeal, highlighting family values of love, trust, and growing up. For my analysis, I incorporated Fisher's narrative paradigm, which was produced in 1984. In this theory, Fisher assumes that humans are storytelling creatures that are persuaded by narratives rather than logic and reason alone. Specifically, a narrative has to satisfy two criteria: narrative probability, which asks, is the story coherent? And narrative fidelity, which asks, does the story ring true to experiences that audiences have had or could have? These two criteria make up what Fisher calls narrative rationality. In 2009, McClure critiques and expands this theory by incorporating Burke's theory of identification, which assumes that you, quote, persuade a man insofar as you speak his language, identifying your way with his, end quote. So McClure's concept of narrative identification then suggests that a story's consistency with culturally held values and norms, goals, notions of rationality, the greater its persuasive potency. And so in summary, if a narrative tells a story that is coherent, rings true to audiences' experiences, and promotes audience identification, it is then rhetorically influential. At this point, I do want to give a brief synopsis of some grief theory so that I can incorporate it into my analysis. Misunderstandings of grief are prominent in popular rhetoric, and these misunderstandings largely assume that grief is a finite and a linear process, that someone who experiences significant loss should perform it a certain way and get over it in a certain amount of time. I will also refer to these norms as the, quote, dominant narrative of grief, as coined by Niemeyer class in Dennis in 2014. So the dominant narrative, it dictates what grief is and ought to be, but it confines many to an experience that does not actually parallel their own. And these social norms simultaneously deny and shape the actual experiences of bereaved individuals, though in different ways. Even though bereaved people rarely identify with this dominant narrative, it is still perpetuated in prominent rhetoric and film and media for an audience desire for happy endings. So audiences identify with these happy endings because it mimics the dominant narrative they're used to seeing, but this is to the disidentification of people who have experienced significant loss. The dominant narrative of grief is far from engendered. For example, social expectations for bereaved mothers and bereaved fathers are very different. Mothers are not only permitted, but are expected to cry, the perfect amount. If they do not cry enough, they are seen as bad mothers. If they cry too much, they are seen as hysterical. Meanwhile, fathers are expected not to cry at all. They are expected to regulate their emotions, remain strong and stoic, grieve only in solidarity, and most importantly, provide for the grieving mother and remaining children. Research shows themes of emotional regulation are prominent in men who experience significant grief. For example, in 2018, Creighton et al. Published a study that showed men take on one of three roles oftentimes, that of a father figure, an adventurer, or a lamplighter. And in all three of these cases, emotionality is undercut, and the men prefer to grieve by doing rather than by expressing. At this point, I do want to add a disclaimer that I'm not saying that action-oriented coping is by any means inferior to emotional expression. Lots of research, especially that by Kenneth Doka, shows that action-oriented coping is just as productive as emotional expression. So it's not my intention to say that that form of coping is wrong. What is wrong is to stigmatize men who do experience their grief emotionally. It is not a coincidence that men statistically engage in these modes of grieving more than women, given the stigma that they ought to keep their emotions in check. And Finding Nemo is another piece of rhetoric that perpetuates the stigma. So I use these concepts to analyze Finding Nemo and find that it does tell a coherent story that rings true and allows for audience identification. The characters, even though they are fish, are personified through abstract concepts such as participating in family activities, going to school, communicating linguistically, experiencing profound emotion. So this satisfies narrative rationality despite the fact that they are non-human characters. And identification, which with these activities and these experiences, promote emotional responses because it makes the story ring true to audiences' experiences. Additionally, Finding Nemo, as many Disney films do, they speak to a multitude of audiences, which enhances their rhetorical power. Meanings are simple and abstract enough to pertain to both children and adults, and the film is polysemic of sorts, where meanings can be drawn from a variety of narratives. For example, Finding Nemo can be a narrative of disability or of mental illness, simply a coming-of-age story, or it could be a grief narrative. Finding Nemo is one of many Disney films where a parent either dies or is readily absent. In this case, Coral, the mother, dies, as does any spoken memory along with her. And one could argue that her death is not pivotal to the plot, that a father could cross the ocean and save his son regardless of whether or not the mother dies at the beginning. But her death, combined with Marlin's anxiety thereafter, makes this film a grief narrative. Marlin's fear of the ocean and fear of losing his son tie directly to his grief. And even though Marlin does not state this grief, a close reading of his character and his plotline make this grief very apparent. Throughout the film, audiences witness Marlin experiencing severe anxiety of the ocean. He is a very overprotective parent. He consistently ingrains into not only his son, but his friend Dory that the ocean is not safe. And he's consistently at odds with his social reclusiveness and his need to keep his son within his sight at all times. And we as audiences see that this anxiety follows his loss. In that first scene at the beginning of the film when Coral is still alive, Marlin is not anxious. He is unafraid, he is enthusiastic, he is excited by the open ocean in his backyard. He even attacks the barracuda as it goes for Coral. But following this loss, he relocates his son as far away from the drop-off as he can. He babies his son by helping him with any inconvenience, and he grants him very little freedom by blaming his overprotective parenting on Nemo's disability, which is in turn denying his own grief. Marlin's grief spurred the turn of events that led to his kidnapping and his adventure across the ocean to save his son. It was both his obstruction and his catalyst. But when the two are reunited and return home, Marlin has a drastic change in character. He excitedly wakes up Nemo for school, makes small talk with the other dads, and when Nemo leaves with his classmates, he says, quote, "Now go have an adventure." Marlin's grand adventure is over, and supposedly so is his grief. This happy ending is satisfying to most audiences who only know grief through the dominant narrative. But it upholds social norms that do not actually parallel the real experiences of those who have experienced significant loss. So this is then to their disidentification. Marlin gets over his grief, and in doing so, he becomes more likable. He becomes more likable to his son, more likable to his community, and most importantly, more likable to audiences. What message do you believe that this sends to those impacted by grief and bereavement? This is not without rhetorical consequence. Given Finding Nemo's rationality and means of identification, the film has persuasive power that I do not think is utilized responsibly. The film excludes acceptance of emotionality or communication about loss at all, and ignores the lifelong experience of grief. Similar to the notion that Marlon's grief was both his obstruction and his catalyst, narratives such as his catalyze audience identification that makes the narrative ring true, but cause attention for bereaved individuals as they negotiate their performance of grief with social expectations of it. And in turn, this obstructs any possibility of expanding social expectations beyond just one way of experiencing grief. Further, Marlon's style of grieving transitions from coping that is unmasculine by expressing emotionality to coping that is masculine by exhibiting strength and bravery. Marlon's fear of the ocean and overprotective parenting of his son exemplify emotional symptoms of grief that leave Marlon with an internal struggle between his grief and his masculinity. At 2 points during the film, we see Marlon try and fail to tell a joke under the expectation that a clownfish ought to be funny. These interactions represent Marlon's internal struggle to live up to that expectation, but through my reading, it's metaphorical for Marlon's internal struggle to live up to the expectation of a father that is masculine and therefore not grieving. Conveniently enough, following Marlon's grand adventure and reestablished, less anxious fatherly role, he's able to successfully tell the joke and follow through on the expectation that a clownfish ought to be funny. Telling this joke represents Marlon following through on the expectation that men must grieve masculinely, or not at all. Marlon earns his bravery and his autonomy through his adventure across the ocean to save his son. And it was through this adventure that he faced his fear of the ocean and, in turn, his own grief. In short, Marlon's response to his loss began as emotional outpourings of anxiety and anger, but became heroic, dynamic, performative, and action-oriented. In other words, Marlon's grief transitioned from unmasculine and stigmatized to masculine and accepted. Not only accepted, but revered. So in summary, Finding Nemo perpetuates hegemonic masculine ideals of grief by insinuating that grief is not a masculine trait at all, which has detrimental effects against the effort to expand the dominant narrative of grief beyond the assumption that grief is unmasculine, linear, and a temporary process. This analysis is intended to provide a basis for future case studies to expand on both Fisher and McClure's frameworks and to examine communicated experiences of how grief should be in prominent rhetoric. I would like to thank Dr. Sarah Hayden for her advising on this paper, as well as the whole communication department at the University of Montana, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.